Hi folks, I just put together a few slides to go over some material where you had some questions in relation to the upcoming test. Just a quick recap, a couple of people had asked, so what do we need or what twin studies are important? I just put the 4 twin studies on the slide that I talked about in the lectures at various points, and it would be important to think about like the main finding or make one of the key messages across these different studies, what they all have shown. And I think one of the key studies that is worth remembering is that the genetic component is typically quite large, and then the environmental component often is non-shared. So this is essentially individual experiences by the twins rather than an effect of the family environment as such. There's also a lot of stuff, or quite a few people ask about further questions, like in relation, for example, to the Candler study. I think it's a really interesting study. This is actually beyond the test as such, but I think these are interesting questions. For example, like what do we know about these genetic effects increasing over time? The issue is that often they're a little bit difficult to disentangle. uh, the one of the results from the Kindler study across these two different samples is that we probably look at what is called genetic unfolding and genetic maturation, which means that over the development, novel genetic effects, will actually start. So as people go through puberty, different genes become activated, and then these effects accumulate during development. Another thing that I didn't really talk that much about, but I think is also important to mention, is we can also look at the variability in between the twins in general. And one of the findings is that if the variability decreases overall, so like the behavioral differences in personality become smaller over developmental time, then that also suggests that there are some kind of environmental, so basically social cultural pressures going on. That's also something that they found. And the biggest or the strongest conclusion that they reached looking across all the different patterns is that potentially we are looking at very complex interactions between genotypes and the environment, which often like may look like it's an environmental effect, but could be driven by these kind of very complex interactions between genes. So what they talked about is essentially like a differential genotype by environmental transaction, by environmental interaction effect. So basically what does that mean? That individuals with specific genetic makeup start interpreting the world in a particular way. So they may be more likely to experience some environmental effects. And then what is important is, if you think about it, for example, if you have a predisposition to experience more negative emotions, then you start interpreting things in your daily life in a more negative way. And then the best option to counter that is by, like embracing these individuals and providing a supportive, positive environment, right? So again, um, the what I think is the really powerful stuff of these heritability studies is trying to help us understand what we can do to help individuals with specific predispositions live better. There was also an interesting question by one of you about twins reared apart. So there's a whole literature on this as well. Um, what they typically show is very strong genetic effects. And then the question was like, what would happen if we rear these twins, um, like in complete isolation by kind of, um, like by robots or something like this. I think first of all there clear ethical problems there. But what we know from a lot of the work from animal models, for example, is these individuals probably would not perform well. So it really comes back also to this kind of genotype by environment interaction that genes need are operating or active in a social environment. And so it's this interaction that is really important. And that's also what's coming through in these kind of very recent big twin studies. So then there was a question about the Big Five, who actually came up with the Big Five. That's one of the big questions. I talked about Kittel, who first showed these structures in the late 1940s, and then Norman, like with some of the Australian data in the 1950s and 60s, who really popularized the Big Five as a model for personality and individual differences is McRae and Costa using their NEO instrument. And then, of course, Louis Goldberg's work, summarizing all these different lexical studies in the early 90s. I did not really make clear distinctions. They're different. The Big Five and the five factor theory, they're actually slightly different in the way they conceptualize personality. So it's not something to really worry about for the test. It's important to know that McRae and Costa, they championed the five-factor model based on basically clinical work, and Goldberg summarized the lexical studies and suggested that there are, like the big five as a separate or as a robust structure that can be found in the English language. There was also a little bit of confusion about the big five versus these different facets. At what moment did the facets come in? The facets is something that has been in, like the gold standard, which is the NEO-PI, so the Costa-McRae measure, has been in that instrument for a long time. And so here on the right-hand side, this is the slide that I had from the measurements session. You can see the facets in the NEO-PI, and these facets now form an important part of the Big Five and the five-factor model, because different models, basically all researchers assume that there are facets underneath the big five as, like the domain factors. But the discussion is, like what kind of facets are relevant and important. And so different researchers have different facets. So that's just important to know that, like the facets have been with us before de Young's model already. So they are part and parcel of the NEO-PI, and the big discussion is essentially what kind of facets would be important for what kind of big five factor. There was also a question again about what's the difference between the CAPS model and the big five. I mean, they're really just very different approaches to thinking about personality. The big five assume that we have stable individual differences that can be captured in the form of some small number of major dimensions, whereas the CAPS model is a very person-focused if-then kind of structure where we look at the cybernetic networks in a way, like the interactions within a person's cognitive system, cognitive affective system. So I talked about, like encodings, how people encode information, how their expectancies, beliefs, their affects, their goals, values, their, competencies that they bring into a situation, their self-regulation aspects all interact with each other to determine some behavior. So the core of the CAPS model is really a very person-specific interactive model, and it does not presume in the original format that we can identify basic predispositions that can be summarized in something like the Big Five. So it's a very different proposal to study individual differences. There was also then some question about the motivational types by Schwartz when we talk about values. The most common distinction that is being made in the psychological literature is between like broad um, the broad dimensions underlying the value space are essentially openness to change, so being like open to new experiences, valuing self-direction, stimulating experiences, versus um, a preoccupation with maintaining the status quo, so conservation values or conservative values, so conformity, tradition, security on one hand, and then on the other hand, the second dimension is self-transcendence versus self-enhancement, which differentiates between a concern for others, both people close to you, so benevolence, as well as like people that you may not know in society in general, like universalism, and that differentiates these values from achievement and power values that are much more self-centered and egoistic, so self-enhancement. So that those two are the main value dimensions that are typically differentiated in psychology. I briefly mentioned that in sociology and political science, people make different distinctions within this value space. Um, but in psychology, these are the important ones. And now the question is what explains this structure. Here, Schwartz argues the motivational compatibilities and conflicts. So universalism and benevolence are compatible with each other because they're focused on the well-being of others. So they're closer located in space to each other, and they are in conflict with achievement and power values because these values are about getting ahead of others. So therefore, there's a conflict. So these kind of conflicts and compatibilities organize the the overall value structure. There was also a little bit of confusion about these sinusoid curves. The main idea is what we can do is we can arrange these values because they're these motivational compatibilities and conflicts. We can arrange them on the x-axis here and then correlate each of these values with another concept or another measure, right? And then we can observe whether, for example, power values correlate negatively. Achievement values also should, according to the theory, should correlate quite negatively because they are motivationally compatible with each other, self-focused, uh, kind of egoistic. And then as we move around the circle, moving towards more other concerning values, so, like more altruistic values, we should see, for example, more positive relations. So what we can do based on this circular structure, we can plot these correlations with third variables and then observe where is the strongest positive correlation, where's the strongest negative correlation to tell us a little bit about what is the motivational concern that is driving this association between values and another construct. So for example, in-group attitudes. So, like for example, this is something in social psychology, people are very concerned about this. So national identity, for example. So the black line here shows the correlation of national identity with the values. And what we can now do is we can see, for example, tradition correlates most positively, universalism correlates uh, in shows the weakest correlation. And so we can plot this curve. We can make some predictions about after tradition, for example, the the closely related values to tradition are conformity and benevolence. So we would expect that conformity and tradition also show positive relations, but somewhat weaker compared to tradition, and so on and so on. And the most important part is we can make theoretical predictions. So if we assume that openness to change versus conservation values are important for understanding national identity, we could predict that uh, this curve here is the hypothetical predicted correlation pattern, and then we can compare the actual observed correlation pattern with that hypothetical one. And this allows us to both make some theoretical predictions based on the motivational compatibilities and conflicts. So we can make a priori predictions how other variables may correlate with the values because they may be underpinned by different motivational dimensions. And then we can also, after we made these predictions, we can actually test how closely our predictions map the empirical observations, so what we actually find in our study, right? And so typically the two motivational dimensions are, that we look at in psychology: self-transcendence, self-enhancement versus openness to change. So we would check whether some correlations are most positive with universalism benevolence, or most positive, for example, with stimulation versus self-direction values, and would then test where is the strongest correlation. So that can be applied also to values and personality. So here are some correlations between, in this case, for example, agreeableness and light gray. So we can see the strongest correlations with benevolence. So agreeableness as a personality trait correlates most positively with benevolence, which makes sense. If you're agreeable, you often care about others, and correlates most negatively with power values. So if you're agreeable, you typically don't try and dominate others. And so we can make both predictions and then observe these patterns to see how well our predictions actually worked out. And then what we can also do is we can, for example, look at personality instruments, different personality instruments that measured, for example, extroversion, openness, neuroticism, and so on. So, think about it, like the NEO-PI by McRae and Costa measures extroversion. The BFI2 that you used in your lab also measures extroversion. So how closely are these extroversion dimensions correlated? And as we can see, they're quite strongly correlated across different instruments. And now what we could do is the darker gray line here. We now could compare the strongest positive correlation between values and personality to see how similar or different like values are in relation to personality. And so what we can see here clearly is for openness, values and openness, so it's probably self-direction, stimulation, are very, very similar to openness traits across different instruments. And agreeableness also, we can see quite strong correlations between agreeableness and typically benevolence. We see the biggest differences in terms of neuroticism. So neuroticism is not really relevant for values. Right, so this is the overall pattern, and would be just good to think about that in a bit more detail. I also talked about the World Value Survey. The World Value Survey uses a different value instrument, but we could potentially represent that within the Schwartz circle as well. This project was started by Ronald Inglehart and is continued by Chris Welzel. And I talked about the World Value Survey when discussing cross-cultural studies on values, because one of the big contributions of the World Value Survey is that it allows us to map out the value importance ratings across different samples around the world. So they use nationally representative samples, ask people every couple of years what are the important values in people's lives, and then we can map out what values, for example, the survival versus self-expression values, for example, being more important in these societies here, and survival values are more important in these societies here, right? So the Inglehart-Welzel project, driven by, or like underlying the World Value Survey, is an example of a study that has looked at cultural differences in values and allows us to map out the importance of values around the world. So now the different question with cross-cultural data is whether the actual dimensions replicate and how these dimensions relate to each other. So the original socio-ecological complexity hypothesis argued that the interrelationship between the big five factors depends on the complexity, socio-ecological complexity of a society. So they used the average income that individuals have, as well as a number of indicators that indicate that capture the complexity of occupational um, of occupations and industry, right? So whether you need to have higher education, need to be more specialized in order to make a living. And what they found in the original study was that with increasing social ecological complexity, the correlations between the big five decreased. So what this means is the big five are more clearly differentiated in more socially complex, socio-ecological complex contexts, and they used a niche diversity perspective, basically, which said if you live in an environment where you need to perform different roles and you need more or more diverse skills to perform these roles, then people will show a more differentiated personality profile. Um, this kind of argument is really interesting. There's also evidence suggesting that it's not just the factor correlations as such, but actually the factor structures itself, so that in more socio-ecologically complex societies, the big five replicate better. So we are more likely to find the big five structure compared to socio-ecologically simpler societies with less occupational diversity. And we would, in those contexts, we would actually not expect to find a clear big five structure. So this also brings me to these lexical studies by Böhle de Raad. I showed this graph, and what this shows is the big five is based on factor analysis. So we can theoretically decide how many factors do we want to extract from data. Excuse me. Yeah. Sorry. So we have to decide how many factors we do want to extract and what is the best trade-off in terms of like explained variance, so how much insight we get compared to, like just the noise and the error that we have in our data. And so what you could do is you could start off with just one factor. So you would assume there's just one factor, and then you increasingly extract more and more factors, and you look at how much uh, additional information do you get by extracting more factors. And so what they found is across 11 different languages, 11 different psycholexical studies, they found that three factors actually provided the best explanation overall, the most robust explanation. And it was they were able to extract, for example, the 5 and even the 6 from the hexaco, but then that the noise increased. So the best option in there, the best replication level was at the three factors, right? So this is what we mean by these factor cascades. We can extract more and more factors, but then the noise increases. So we have to make some decisions in terms of where's the best balance between actually capturing something meaningful versus just capturing noise. Moving then to how can we apply all of this, we in class and also in your first lab, we looked at the BFI2, how we could score ourselves. So, have a look how to create a mean and a standard deviation. And then the mean and the standard deviation are dependent on the scale that we used. Is it a response scale from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7? And one option or one thing we can do is if we have a reference population, so we have some data from where this instrument has been um, applied already, so we have the mean from a comparison population, we can now norm this. So we take the score of the individual, take away the normative mean and divide it by the standard deviation, and then we can express the score of the individual in relation to that population mean. That population that mean now would be 0, and then we can look at whether the individual is how far away from that mean. And because we divide by the standard deviation, so now the standard deviation is 1. So basically, it's an interval around the mean. And so if the score of the individual after this rescoring is above 1, we know the individual is 1 standard deviation above the mean. If the score now is below -1, we know the individual is 1 standard deviation below the mean. In personality, we often rescale this normal distribution, the Z-trend, this kind of Z distribution, and use so-called T-scores. All we do there is we multiply the Z score by 10 and then add 50. So what happens is we have a mean of 50, so the mean is now 50, and the interval, 1 standard deviation above and below the mean is now 10. So 60 means an individual is 1 standard deviation above the mean, um, and 40 means an individual is 1 standard deviation below the mean. So what this all means is we can now make references to a normative population, so we can compare an individual with a normative population. And if you have scores from 2 or more individuals, we can also make comparisons relative um, between these individuals. Some people actually argue this is the more relevant information because if you're looking at applicants, for example, this is the important information that you need to keep track of. How do people perform relative to each other? But though both interpretations can be used, so we can compare scores against the normative scores that are captured by these T-scores, and we can also compare individuals relative to each other. All of this is underpinned by a so-called latent variable model. So just really quickly, the assumption in a latent variable model world is that we have observed scores, for example, our scores on a Big Five instrument, and the assumption is that there is some unobserved latent variable here that causally um, explains the scores on the personality inventory. So, for example, we would assume that there is an underlying latent variable called extroversion that explains why some individuals respond more positively to these items compared to other individuals, right? So that is it. It is a causal model where we presume that there is an underlying uh, variable that explains why individuals score higher or lower on these specific items. And finally, there had been some questions about what is this ground truth thing, right? So this is something that really emerged with the use of machine learning, because now what we can do is we can take all sorts of information that we harvest from the internet, from wearable sensors, etc., and we try and make sense of this data. We could, for example, apply principal component or factor analysis the same way that Cattell did initially to come up with like the first version of some kind of Big Five. What machine learning people have argued though is when we do this, if we use this information from social media, for example, should we compare this structure that we find or these results that we find from social media with self-report data from surveys, or should we actually compare that with some other information from that we gather from, for example, from the person's lives, right? So this is the ground truth problem, because here the question becomes, is the best information that we have really a survey, or should we look at some other information that is independent of surveys? So this problem was not really there for psychologists when they came up with the Big Five, because we had no easy way to look at other information. But now that we have, like surveys, and we have access to all sorts of other information about individuals, a valid question is, what is the best way of validating our personality dimensions, for example? And so that's also something like when I talked about, these modern lexical studies, like the work by Condon, um, where they, like use some very advanced algorithms to see what kind of words go together, which is exactly the same thing that Cattell did with his rating studies, but Condon uses machine learning and all these language models to see what is the likelihood of certain words going together when people write on the internet about themselves or others. And so what Condon did is a modern version of these lexical studies, and he found essentially three factors that kind of replicate relatively closely in comparison to self-reports, right? So he used self-reports as the kind of validation standard, and this again raises the question, is this actually the best comparison, or should we now compare these emerging structures with something else? So that's the ground truth problem. Okay, these are some of the questions that you guys raised. I hope this helped to clarify it, and best of luck with your test.